It was fairly known that Mrs. Tretherick had run away, taking Mr. Tretherick's own child with her. There was some excitement and much diversity of opinion in Fiddletown. The Dutch flat intelligencer openly alluded to the forcible abduction of the child with the same freedom, and it's to be feared the same prejudice, with which it had criticized the abductor's poetry. All of Mrs. Tretherick's own sex, and perhaps a few of the opposite sex, whose distinctive quality was not, however, very strongly indicated, fully coincided in the views of the intelligencer. The majority, however, evaded the moral issue. That Mrs. Tretherick had shaken the red dust of Fiddletown from her dainty slippers was enough for them to know. They mourned the loss of the fair abductor more than her offense. They promptly rejected Tretherick as an injured husband and disconsolate father, and even went so far as to openly cast discredit on the sincerity of his grief. They reserved an ironical condolence for Colonel Starbottle, overbearing that excellent man with untimely and demonstrative sympathy in bar-rooms, saloons, and other localities not generally deemed favorable to the display of sentiment. "She was allus a skittish thing, Colonel," said one sympathizer with a fine affectation of gloomy concern and great readiness of illustration, "and it's kinda natural that she'd get away some day and stampede that there colt. But that she should shake you, Colonel, that she should just shake you is what gets me. And they do say that you just hung around that hotel all night and payrolled them corridors and hoisted yourself up and down them stairs and meandered in and out of that piazza, and all for nothing." It was another generous and tenderly commiserating spirit that poured additional oil and wine on the Colonel's wounds. "The boys here let on that Mrs. Tretherick prevailed on you to pack your trunk and a baby over from the house to the stage office, and that the chap as did go off with her thanked you and offered you 2 short bits and said as how he liked your looks and 'd employ you again. And now you say it ain't so. Well, I'll tell the boys it ain't so, and I'm glad I met you, for stories do get around." Happily for Mrs. Tretherick's reputation, however, the Chinaman in Tretherick's employment, who was the only eyewitness of her flight, stated that she was unaccompanied except by the child. He further deposed that, obeying her orders, he had stopped the Sacramento coach and secured a passage for herself and child to San Francisco. It was true that Ah Fe's testimony was of no legal value, but nobody doubted it. Even those who were skeptical of the pagan's ability to recognize the sacredness of the truth admitted his passionless, unprejudiced unconcern. But it would appear from a hitherto unrecorded passage of his veracious chronicle that herein they were mistaken. It was about 6 months after the disappearance of Mrs. Tretherick that Ah Fe, while working in Tretherick's lot, was hailed by 2 passing Chinamen. They were the ordinary mining coolies equipped with long poles and baskets for their usual pilgrimages. An animated conversation at once ensued between Ah Fe and his brother Mongolians, a conversation characterized by that usual shrill volubility and apparent animosity which was at once the delight and scorn of the intelligent Caucasian who did not understand a word of it. Such at least was the feeling with which Mr. Tretherick on his veranda, and Colonel Starbottle, who was passing, regarded their heathenish jargon. The gallant colonel simply kicked them out of his way. The irate Tretherick, with an oath, threw a stone at the group and dispersed them, but not before 1 or 2 slips of yellow rice paper marked with hieroglyphics were exchanged, and a small parcel put into Ah Fe's hands. When Ah Fe opened this in the dim solitude of his kitchen, he found a little girl's apron, freshly washed, ironed, and folded. On the corner of the hem were the initials C.T. Ah Fe tucked it away in a corner of his blouse and proceeded to wash his dishes in the sink with a smile of guileless satisfaction. 2 days after this, Ah Fe confronted his master. "Me no like Fiddletown. Me belly sick. Me go now." Mr. Tretherick violently suggested a profane locality. Ah Fe gazed at him placidly and withdrew. Before leaving Fiddletown, however, he accidentally met Colonel Starbottle, and dropped a few incoherent phrases which apparently interested that gentleman. When he concluded, The colonel handed him a letter and a $20 gold piece. "If you bring me an answer, I'll double that. Sabe, John?" Ah Fe nodded. An interview equally accidental, with precisely the same result, took place between Ah Fe and another gentleman whom I suspect to have been the youthful editor of the Avalanche. Yet I regret to state that, after proceeding some distance on his journey, Ah Fe calmly broke the seals of both letters, and after trying to read them upside down and sideways, finally divided them into accurate squares, and, in this condition, disposed of them to a brother celestial whom he met on the road for a trifling gratuity. The agony of Colonel Starbottle on finding his wash bill made out on the unwritten side of one of those squares, and delivered to him with his weekly clean clothes, and the subsequent discovery that the remaining portions of his letter were circulated by the same method from the Chinese laundry of one Feng Ti of Fiddletown, has been described to me as peculiarly affecting. Yet I am satisfied that a higher nature, rising above the levity induced by the mere contemplation of the insignificant details of this breach of trust, would find ample retributive justice in the difficulties that subsequently attended Ah Fe's pilgrimage. On the road to Sacramento he was twice playfully thrown from the top of the stagecoach by an intelligent but deeply intoxicated Caucasian, whose moral nature was shocked at riding with one addicted to opium smoking. At Hangtown he was beaten by a passing stranger, purely an act of Christian supererogation. At Dutch Flat he was robbed by well-known hands from unknown motives. At Sacramento he was arrested on suspicion of being something or other, and discharged with a severe reprimand, possibly for not being it, and so delaying the course of justice. At San Francisco he was freely stoned by children of the public schools, but by carefully avoiding these monuments of enlightened progress, he at last reached, in comparative safety, the Chinese quarters, where his abuse was confined to the police and limited by the strong arm of the law. The next day he entered the wash-house of Chai Fook as an assistant, and on the following Friday was sent with a basket of clean clothes to Chai Fook's several clients. It was the usual foggy afternoon as he climbed the long windswept hill of California Street, one of those bleak, gray intervals that made the summer a misnomer to any but the liveliest San Franciscan fancy. There was no warmth of color in earth or sky, no light nor shade within or without, only one monotonous, universal, neutral tint over everything. There was a fierce unrest in the wind-whipped streets. There was a dreary, vacant quiet in the gray houses. When Ah Fe reached the top of the hill, the Mission Ridge was already hidden, and the chill sea breeze made him shiver. As he put down his basket to rest himself, it is possible that to his defective intelligence and heathen experience, this God's own climate, as was called, seemed to possess but scant tenderness, softness, or mercy. But it is possible that Ah Fe illogically confounded this season with his old persecutors, the school-children, who, being released from studious confinement at this hour, were generally most aggressive. So he hastened on, and turning a corner, at last stopped before a small house. It was the usual San Franciscan urban cottage. There was the little strip of cold green shrubbery before it, the chilly bare veranda, and above this, again, the grim balcony on which no one sat. Ah Fe rang the bell. A servant appeared, glanced at his basket, and reluctantly admitted him, as if he were some necessary domestic animal. Ah Fe silently mounted the stairs, and entering the open door of the front chamber, put down the basket, and stood passively on the threshold. A woman who was sitting in the cold gray light of the window, with a child in her lap, rose listlessly and came toward him. Ah Fe instantly recognized Mrs. Tretherick, but not a muscle of his immobile face changed, nor did his slant eyes lighten as he met her own placidly. She evidently did not recognize him as she began to count the clothes, but the child, curiously examining him, suddenly uttered a short, glad cry. "Why, it's John, Mama! It's our old John that we had in Fiddletown!" For an instant Ah Fe's eyes and teeth electrically lightened. The child clapped her hands and caught at his blouse. Then he said shortly, "Me John, Ah Fe, all the same. Me know you, How do?" Mrs. Tretherick dropped